let's get into the album a little bit so we can set some context to understand how this was made. The album, it's called World Clique. It was released in August of 1990 to Elektra Records. Unsurprisingly, there's not a lot of information out there on this record. There's a little bit about the band, but there's no behind the music, no documentary, no memoir. So, some of this information is sort of pieced together just through interviews and such, but this band did not have a huge, lasting, enduring legacy or body of work. I don't know, maybe there are some of these artifacts out there, but I didn't feel very motivated to track some of that stuff down. But again, I think it's safe to say most people's knowledge of this album comes from Groove Is in the Heart, which was a monster hit. And I feel like I still hear the song all the time to this day on various playlists or wherever you hear these things walking around in life. And, honestly, we could probably stop the show here and you've already heard all you need to know from this record. But according to Wikipedia, apparently they did release a few more singles from this record. But after Groove Is in the Heart, I really didn't hear much from this group again. I know they did 2 albums after this for obvious reasons. Now, if you want to kind of understand like what this band is all about and you haven't seen the video, you really should go back and watch this because again, like musically, like we mentioned, it's not like the rest of the record, but the vibe, if you want to kind of very quickly get your arms around what they were trying to do and what they were all about, it's all in the video. It's completely over the top. It's got this retro 60s Technicolor swirling psychedelic effects. There's goofy costumes. People are dancing everywhere. Bootsy Collins and Q-Tip from A Tribe Called Quest show up in the first, 30 seconds. It's definitely a party. It looks like a good time.
Almost
But the
almost an Austin Powers esque thing.
Oh yeah,
If you
totally,
haven't seen it
totally.
and you want to kind of place it.
definitely that's a great comp for sure. I honestly, the note I had was it looks like if Scooby-Doo filmed a live action dance video. It's,
Mm.
it's the note I had.
Yeah, there's a
But
little flower
again,
power thing going on, definitely.
Mhm.
exactly, like very retro hip, trying to turn back the clock with what was at the time some pretty modern music. But it was everywhere on MTV. You couldn't turn on MTV for more than a half hour without seeing this video back in 1990, 91. And within this video, though, it very prominently features the front woman of this band, a woman named Kieran Magenta Kirby, who went by the stage name aforementioned of Lady Miss Kier. And suffice to say, this was obviously a stage name, this Lady Miss Kier, but really it was this whole persona that she cultivated. The best way I could sum it up is she looks almost like a 70s Bond woman in just in terms of her vibe with these platform shoes and wigs and full body suits, tights and everything like that. Now, as part of this character or this persona that she cultivated, she would constantly use this phrase "ooh la la" in a very sultry sort of voice. I wouldn't have thought this was particularly unique thing to say. I don't think she coined this phrase, but she apparently thought it was very unique because that phrase, among other things, was one of the big reasons she brought a massive multi-year lawsuit against Sega, the video game company, for apparently stealing her likeness for a character in a Dreamcast game called Space Channel 5. I went and looked at this. I didn't think it
What?
looked that much like her, but she was so into this persona that
Hmm.
she actually thought that her likeness was being ripped off.
I hope she
She
didn't
did,
win that case.
yeah, seriously.
She did not win, and
Yeah.
let me just tell you,
Did she also sue
apparently,
Gary Larson from The Far Side for making every woman in his cartoons have the same hairstyle that she has?
wait, is that true?
No, no.
I was like, man, this is good info. I didn't come across this. That's gold.
I can't believe Dreamcast got a mention on this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, she
Well,
might have lost her lawsuit because Dreamcast just went out of business like for failing hard.
well, when you hear how this lawsuit went, she probably could have waited them out another few years and been fine. But apparently, to hear her tell it, they reached out to her in the year 2000 to see if she wanted to promote this new video game using Groove Is in the Heart as the music. I think they were going to pay her something in the neighborhood of like 16 grand, which I probably wouldn't have felt that compelled to do if I were her either in that situation, just because how much money she probably made off the song. But when she refused, they made this character anyway, and they actually named the character Ooh La La. And so that is what
Oh.
got her all worked up. She then sued them, saying they stole her likeness and her catchphrase. This lawsuit went on for like 4 to 5 years with appeals, and she really like went the distance with this. Finally, a judge ruled in favor of Sega in 2006, saying that they were able to show that they already had this character developed, and so on and so forth. And she was ordered to pay their legal bills to the tune of 600 grand.
Whoa.
Damn.
That's a lot of
So
platform shoes.
so I know we've chronicled some really bad business decisions on this show, but that has to rank up there as among the worst. Somebody wants to hand you 16 grand and you end up having to give them 600,000 because you think you created this fairly derivative character.
Yikes.
Now, the funniest part of all this, though, is that they did end up a couple years later licensing that song for another video game that also had this character. So I think she, finally realized you don't have to go along with it, but you didn't really create something that new here.
They
Well,
came
that'd
back
be
and
funny
were
if-
like, all right, $500 this time. She's like,
I was
oh,
gonna say
fine,
that,
I'll
yeah.
fucking take it.
That'd be funny if they like took the money they won in the first lawsuit and like dialed in the graphics a little bit better. Like tried again. Made it look more like her.
Then they made a Ukrainian guy with a man bun, and no, well, on that note, so again, she was basically the face of this group. The persona was what most people saw, but this was part of a trio that also included a Ukraine-born DJ named Dmitry Brill, who went by Supa DJ Dmitry. I wish I could get through that without laughing. And a Japanese DJ named Toa Te, who went by Jungle DJ Toa Toa. Now, I will say this about him. He seems to be the only one, as far as I can tell, that actually carved out any sort of respectable solo career after this whole venture, for whatever that's worth. But we're back in the late 80s here with some of these names.
I don't understand. I thought the whole point of having DJ in your name was that it was the first thing in the name. You're like DJ something. You can't be super DJ something or jungle DJ something. You're going against the DJ naming conventions. I don't like it. I don't know if they were trying to innovate or not. It's an absolute failure and it's stupid.
Yeah, I'm just hoping I don't have to talk about him that much more in this episode, because Supa DJ Dimitri, it's not working for me at all. But I do think part of this tapestry that they had, and in addition to this retro vibe, you had a pretty eclectic group of people that setting the music aside, you really didn't see much in mainstream music at that time, especially anything that was on MTV. So I think that was a big part of their appeal, was this multicultural piece. Now, a little bit more about Miss Lady Keir. So she was born in Ohio, 1963, spent most of her childhood bopping around. I don't know if she was like a military kid, but spent time in Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., among other areas. Again, not much background, but seems like a pretty fairly unremarkable upbringing that she had. But she grew and ultimately, when she was 17, moved to New York City to study fashion at the Fashion Institute of Technology. It sounds like this is sort of what you hear with Berklee College of Music, where as soon as she got there, she realized the academic route wasn't for her, and so she dropped out immediately. And she actually made her living, as Tom mentioned earlier, as partly as a go-go dancer, but also she started making her own disco-inspired outfits and basically selling them to people at these local nightclubs. And so, this was probably 1980, 81. So it was still coming off the heels of the disco era in New York. And so these outfits were a big part of the scene. And so that's where she, kind of hitched her wagon really to get involved into this scene. So it was in 1982, after she had been there for, a year or two, she meets Dmitry Brill, Supa DJ Dimitri, aforementioned, when he commissioned her to make him a glitter blue spacesuit and silver platform boots for one of his musical projects that was playing in New York City. So what a time to be alive, I guess.
That sounds like a show I might go to.
I would check that out for, $4 at a New York club at the
Listen,
time. Certainly.
I think Tom and I can both say we appreciate bands that have outfits.
Oh yeah, yeah. I like bands that go for it.
Sure.
I don't have to listen to their album though.
No one said that about our bands though. No.
Yeah.
So actually she and Dimitri end up dating, and they basically kind of oriented their lives around the club scene. So he was a DJ, he was spinning, 5 to 6 nights a week in various clubs. She would literally just show up and dance, but would also try to sell her various wares to the club goers. And they basically just made this their lives for 4 to 5 years. And apparently they were fairly straight edge. They weren't there for booze or coke or whatever most people were probably going to the clubs for back then. Just sort of there for the hang and for him to play. But again, back to the story that I kicked off this episode with, I don't know what caused them to do this, but after being totally straight edge, one night in 1986, they both took a dose of LSD and essentially started a band that night. According to an interview she did with DJ Magazine, which is apparently a thing, they dropped acid. They wrote 3 songs that night and formed the band proper that night. And then out of that, they ended up writing 30 more songs over the next year or so. And I'll put songs in air quotes.
Hold on a second.
There were 30 more titles that she
They-
could shout over his beats.
They had 30 songs and they whittled it down to this bullshit.
And this was like before they even met the third guy. So it was a back catalog of hits apparently. But so they start actually getting some traction in these clubs in New York City, because I guess what they were putting together was different enough and drawing from all these different, influences and, this meld of sound that was happening at that time. And apparently Miss Keir found $500 in the back of a taxi cab at one point in like the mid 80s, and wisely, I would say, bought a sampler at the time. And that's what they used to start putting together a lot of this music over the next few years. And the sampler apparently became such a big part of their sound that they formed a production company called, get this, Sampladelic. You like that?
Real original. They're just really breaking ground here.
Well, I will say what's interesting, I don't like much about this. There are people that point to them as pioneers in this genre, and maybe it's because they were doing some of this first, but first isn't always best, I guess.
I can get down with they did it first in
do it
terms
well.
of their importance for the scene, but I don't necessarily know if they even really did do it first, right? Because weren't like the Dust Brothers doing stuff in the 80s and making stuff that was a lot more layered and complicated than this stuff?
I don't know the whole lineage, and this is maybe where our house electronic music people will correct us on this, but I don't
You
know
mean
how
all the fans we gained by covering the Prodigy so glowingly?
Yes.
Yeah, anyone who hung with us after that surely does not give two shits about this kind of music. But what I think people did like about their sound, at least at the time, was that this was pretty early in the hip hop era, and it was before Paul's Boutique was released. So this was still like the Wild West of samples, and there's no way they could have gotten away with this music if they had even been a few years after that. And I do think this is where you have to give them their due a little bit in they were really going through these records exhaustively and pulling in sounds that weren't necessarily being heard a lot mixed together at that time, pulling in a lot of 60s and 70s, jazz funk, pulling in, some 60s acid rock. And I think especially some of the groove oriented music. And I think that you could make the argument that they had actually tapped into some of that P-Funk aesthetic even before like Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, who obviously did it much, much better, but they seemed pretty plugged into that type of sound as far as this music goes. And so that just allowed them to really build this following where they're starting to play every night in New York, these really long sets, which ultimately is how they connected with that third member, DJ Toa Toa, who I think had just come from Japan, and really he was known for having this massive record collection. And so he and Dimitri basically started programming all the music for their songs. She would write the lyrics and maybe some of the vocal harmonies. It's unclear on what that writing process looked like. I think some of them were even playing instruments on stage, but mostly they were behind the turntable. Tom, you look like you were going to say
I
something.
mean, I write the lyrics. Are you fucking kidding me?
I
I mean, I know how this came about. And again, I was not there, but I'm just gonna go ahead and use logic here and say that they were like, we have to play for 5 hours tonight. And she was like, great, I'm gonna get on stage and dance. And when I have an idea, I'm just gonna shout it out. Like, I just want to hear a good beat. And I'll say that for like 5 minutes. Hey, that's a song. I wrote some lyrics. Like, you didn't write lyrics. Something came into your head and you just said it into a microphone. That doesn't mean you wrote lyrics.
Well,
It's
you don't believe in the
relatable.
power of love? Is that what I'm hearing? So ultimately, though, they're getting tons of heat in the club scene, and somehow there's actually a bidding war to sign them amongst a handful of record companies. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my notes here. So there's actually a bidding war somehow to sign them to a record deal. They end up signing with Elektra to produce and release this record.
How many
Now,
records do they sign for?
well, they only made 3. So
Yeah, but the deal that they signed with Elektra was a 7 album deal. 7 album deal with Elektra.
Damn.
Somehow, this just goes to show that I feel like record executives are so out of touch with like what people want in general. They just hear about a
Oh,
trend and they're like, "Oh yeah,
Well,
my
the
friend told me she
Elektra,
bought a Coke in a club and said it was great."
maybe in 1990, no one would do that now.
What, give them a 7 record deal?
Well, that's just like the MTV boom, music boom, where everyone's trying to find the next artist.
I think it
Sign 'em
that
up.
I think that kind of deal may have become standard for a time, and then the premise was that you were going to negotiate out of it later if you wanted to. Because I seem to remember Incubus also signed a 7 record deal like in the late '90s.
They did. Yeah, good recall. That was like 125 episodes ago.
Well, I also remember that you recall last week. It was last week, right? The Doors. That's also Elektra, and they kind of cut their teeth in the '60s on being in tune with what the kids were listening to. So maybe they just took it a little too far by the late '80s.
Yeah.
well, I think the real part is 7 albums is obviously a lot for any unknown band, but how could you look at this material and think that they have 7 albums in the tank? Honestly, I almost liken it to when a sports team gives an outlandishly long contract to an athlete, knowing they're probably only going to get 2 to 3 good years that they can really bank, and then the rest of it is sort of a loss leader. I can only think that was them trying to really capitalize on this, but they
Well, they're
got
probably
to
like
3 and then
they're
called
like,
it.
we play like 35 hours of music a week live. And like, well, they got so much material. They probably got 7 out. Like, no, it's like 6 songs a night that we just play for 3 hours while this lady
And
shouts over it.
even those are pretty undeveloped, let's be honest. We're not
Yeah.
like using the time creatively or anything.
Yeah. We have 3 hooks in total. We can stretch that out during 7 albums for sure. Now, the most interesting part of all this, I think, in a little bit of a twist, so they get signed in 1989-ish. They released the record in 1990, but a year or two before that, in 1988, apparently Lady Miss Kier had written a fan letter to Bootsy Collins, and this to me is one of those stories that just seems so implausible and never actually happens outside of a movie. But literally, it's as simple as they were a fan of P-Funk. They were using a lot of their music in their samples. She writes a letter with a demo tape that included the song Groove is in the Heart. And just, I don't know what the request was, if it was, hey, do you want to just come play bass or hang out? And he actually calls them back and he says, I dig this. I would try to imitate his voice if I could, but you can picture Bootsy saying this. I dig this. If you ever get signed, hit me back up and I'll help you out. So they get signed and they took him up on it. And so he comes down to the studio and he
Yeah.
goes, so do you think you might want some horns on this? And they go, oh, well, who do you have in mind? And he's like, oh, I don't know. I was thinking like Maceo Parker and Fred Wesley, only the best horn players in the world who played in, Parliament Funkadelic. Which brings us to our favorite segment on the show, which is called By the Numbers. Let's start on that note with the number 0. which is the number of seconds that Bootsy Collins actually plays bass on Groove is in the Heart. I feel like this is such a misnomer because he's in the video, he's holding the bass. If you bring in Bootsy, why is he not going to play bass? But the bass line, which is a pretty iconic line at this point, is one of the lines that I learned when I first started playing bass and thought I was the shit when I figured it out. But it's actually a sample from a Herbie Hancock song called Bring Down the Birds, which was from a movie soundtrack for a movie called Blow Up in 1967. So astute listeners may know that in that period of time, he was doing a lot of freelance work to make money. And so that was one of the things that he put together. So despite Bootsy being featured all over the video for that song and essentially just being Bootsy on the song, he really actually doesn't play bass on it.
It was
well, I mean, Herbie Hancock has writing credit on the song. I doubt you want to pay for two different bass lines, you know?
well, also, the guy that does play bass on it is the famous Ron Carter. So,
oh, yeah.
Already covered.
Yeah.
Exactly. A little less fanfare associated with him than Bootsy, but yes, not a lightweight by any stretch on the bass. Let's climb things up slowly to the number 1, which is the number of tracks called out by our boy Robert Christgau as the only choice cut from this record. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna look this. Oh shit. I might have to add the song later because I, for some reason, left the actual song title out of my notes. But there was one song in his review that he said was a choice cut. It was not Groove is in the Heart.
The only choice cut was not Groove is in the Heart.
Somehow, even the best get it wrong from time to time.
Good Lord, Christgau, get your shit together.
Let's climb up even further to the number 2. If you're noticing a trend here, again, we sort of mentioned this, the number of records they released after this before the group finally hung it up. So not an extremely distinguished career to this point. The number 11, which is the number of samples that actually show up on Groove is in the Heart alone, let alone, the rest of the album. So again, I think they cleared these with what was legal at the time, but I don't think there's any way that they could make this now and have it be in any way commercially viable. But they're sampling everything from that whistling sound that's like a doop, the drum beat. It's an entire tapestry of samples. I think it works well for that song, not so much for others, but 11 on that one alone.
Just sounds like a lot more effort was put into this song. I mean, I just think that's really clear.
They knew
without question. I mean, the fact that it has changes and things drop out and there's interesting tension in space. That alone.
Just to stay internally consistent with ourselves, I think that's the thing we can never forgive. Is a lack of effort on the tape.
Yes, 100%. If somebody gets an opportunity like this and phones it in and then still manages to be successful, I'm super annoyed. Like lots of bands phone it in and just nothing goes anywhere. But this band could have done this multiple times. Now, they might not have all been as good as Groove is in the Heart, but like we said before, the rest of the stuff's not even in the same league. It's not even close. It's like they gave up and just padded the rest of the album with filler. Unforgivable.
Yeah, they mailed it in. And it's very one-hit wonder, which speaks to this number I'll throw at you now, which is the number 211 million, which is the number of Spotify plays for Groove is in the Heart. That alone isn't the most groundbreaking number ever, but for comparison's sake, their next most played track, which is called What Is Love, clocks in at a meager 4 million. So that might be the biggest delta that I think I've ever seen.
53x.
But seriously though, those 4 million, 3.9 million of those people were looking for that song. What is love? Baby, don't hurt
That's a
me.
great point. They were looking for
No
Hadaway.
way that anybody's looking that shit up and be like, oh yeah.
Deee-Lite, of course. Of course it's
Of course, that sounds like a Deee-Lite song. Yeah.
Hey, they got lucky in a lot of ways. I think that much is obvious. And look, I mean, if we ever do a 90s one-hit wonder song battle, this could certainly test out of the entrance exam with those kind of numbers. And then The final number is the number 5, which is the number of stars we would love for you to give us on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. Honestly, we love seeing all the great reactions. It feels great to put this out there and see people reacting, especially in a positive way. But even the ones that boosh us a little bit, we still find funny. So much so that we would love to take this opportunity to introduce our newest segment called Boosh of the Week, where we'll take a dose of our own medicine and read a recent 5-star review of the podcast. If it happens to have a little bit of complaining, if it happens to have a complaint or two, I think they call that eating your own dog food or something to that effect. But hey, if we're going to dish it out, we can take it as well. So I want to read a recent 5-star review that came in from username Not That Jack Nicholas. The review is titled Strangely Addictive. He goes on to write, I found this podcast while doing a search for deep dives into 90s music. The first episode I listened to was Odelay by Beck, which they treated fairly and dropped a number of interesting nuggets of info I didn't know about. The second was Surfer Rosa by Pixies, which they unmitigatedly fumbled. My jaw hit the floor when they mentioned, quote, this guy named Steve Albini, end quote, as if it was the first time they were hearing about him. Listen, I can drop some editorial comments in here because I led that episode, but listen, we didn't make that for you, okay? But thanks for the review anyway. So he goes on to say, so I listened to a few more episodes and then a few more and then a few more. I was on a business trip with 12 hours of driving, and now I can't stop. Haven't heard the whole back catalog yet, but I'm probably 2/3 of the way through it, and I find myself really looking forward to each new episode as they drop. Y'all have charmed me. Keep it up.
Hey,
Nice. Yeah, and just hey man, I'm still supporting calling Steve Albini that guy.
yeah.
I'm in support of that.
I feel
by
like
it.
he would have been fine with that. He didn't think he was more than some guy. I'm assuming he was pretty humble guy.
Like he's some kind of royalty. Get over yourself,
Yeah.
you assholes.
Right.
Should we post? We should post on our Patreon page the article about Steve Albini's somewhat
Oh yeah. Sexual
degenerate
preferences.
predilections. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Jesus
We're
Christ.
not gonna malign the dead here or anything like that, but I have a lot less reverence for him since then.
I was sure that you were going to reference his unfounded hatred of Steely Dan, which is really what makes him public enemy number 1 on this show.
Obviously.
Now, leaving us a review is an excellent way to help support what we're doing. 5-star, of course, would be our preference, but don't be afraid to boost us a little bit in the process. But if you do want to go the extra mile, you can interact with our Patreon at the free level. Even $5 a month will give you access to tons of bonus content like our recently concluded 70s one-hit wonder song battle. So thank you. Appreciate the support.